Welcome to Awake to Truth Ministry. We are honored, thankful, and blessed to have with us as our guest today retired Israeli ambassador, consultant to the U.S. Congress, Yoram Ettinger. He has a very interesting and varied background. He has over 50 years as a researcher, a lecturer, a consultant, author, all-around nice guy. And what's extremely nice is that his education partly was in the States. He attended the University of Texas, El Paso, and he also finished his studies at UCLA, where he received his master's degree. He told me today, as we were chatting before we started recording, that he also, in addition to all of these accolades, he was a consul general in Houston, which is clearly near and dear to the heart of us Texans. And best of all, I'm going to ask him to share about it, but he named his daughter, it's a Hebrew name that means bluebonnet. So with no further introduction, Ambassador, would you please tell us, let's start with your daughter named Bluebonnet and then go from there.
Well, as you indicated, I did my undergraduate in Texas. I have relatives in Texas, in El Paso, Texas. I served as Israel's Consul General in Texas, in Houston, Texas. And my wife and I have become very much attached to the Texas people, Texas state of mind, Texas culture, bluegrass, especially country western music, and the scenes of the hill country, East Texas, West Texas. And when our youngest daughter was born, during my service as a diplomat in Houston, Texas, my wife and I decided to name her with the Hebrew name for bluebonnet in order to make it clear how attached we are to Texas, which in many, many respects for us is home away from home.
Well, we are honored that you feel that way. We treasure that. And the fact that you named your daughter Bluebonnet is extremely special. So we definitely have a great connection.
Well, thank you very much. And we feel very much at home because Texas is the Lone Star State, and we view Israel as the state of the Lone Star of David. And
Yes.
As Lone Stars, both Texans and Israelis have known the meaning of overcoming challenges and overcoming adversity and proving our can-do capabilities. And in many respects, we share common state of mind, common values, which has made Texas very special among the 50 states, the only one who joined the union rather than be purchased by the union or be occupied by the union. And in that respect, the spirit of independence is very, very intrinsic in Texas, as it is in the Jewish state in Israel.
That is well said. Another thing that I'm going to just interject, I feel that one of the bonds that we also have is the hard work, that the work ethic that Texans have, that Israelis have. We work hard, you work hard. And I think that that's an important trait that everyone should have, but unfortunately, not everyone feels that way.
Well, there's no doubt that we both know that there are no free lunches. And not only that, but we have known through our experience, just like Texans, that we must not get off the horse precisely when the horse or when the bull is bucking. And just like Texans, we have faced multitude of challenges. Probably Unlike Texas, our challenges have been mostly terrorism and wars initiated by our neighbors, but we have proven our capabilities to stay on top of the bucking bull, I would say longer than the 9 seconds, which feature very prominently in Billy Bob's and other sites in Texas.
Right. So we were talking before we came on about the incredible return on investment of the money that the U.S. sends to Israel, the incredible return on investment that we get back. I would like you to really drill down on that, if you would, please.
Well, there is a misperception among many Americans that Israel gets an annual foreign aid from the U.S. First of all, we are not foreign, and that requires maybe a different session, which goes back to the early pilgrims and the founding fathers who established a culture which is based to a large degree on Judeo-Christian values, and therefore historically, religiously, value-wise, we're not foreign. But
No.
most importantly, as far as contemporary times are concerned, we don't get foreign aid, namely overseas Social Security. It's an American investment which has produced very high return on investment. In fact, a few 100% year in and year out, benefiting the American taxpayer. And one of the litany of examples has to do with Texas. There is in Fort Worth the Lockheed Martin plant, which manufactures the F-35 and the F-16 combat aircraft. Both are employed by Israel, certainly as a sign of U.S. generosity towards Israel. We receive it from the U.S., but this is only one part of the transaction, because every single day, literally every single day, the plant in Fort Worth, as I was told by one of the plant managers, receives from the Israeli Air Force lessons learned by the Israeli combat pilots operationally, maintenance-wise, and repairs. Those lessons, according to the plant manager in Fort Worth, have saved the manufacturer some 10 to 20 years of research and development.
Wow.
By applying those lessons as upgrades to the next generation of those combat planes, F-16 and F-35. For instance, in the F-16, there are more than 600 modifications, upgrades, resulting from the Israeli experience. And according to the plant manager, the value of those 10 to 20 years saving of research and development resulting from Israel sharing its lessons with the manufacturers have totaled, according to him, mega billion dollars. But not only that, those lessons, those upgrades have enhanced the competitiveness of Lockheed Martin, formerly GD, have enhanced the competitiveness in the global market, which is increasing the exports of those planes, the F-35 and the F-16, which comes up to a few more billions of dollars, and thereby expanding the employment base in Texas. We receive a few hundred military systems from the U.S., for which we are immensely grateful, but we return to the U.S. On each one of those military systems. We return greatly through the lessons which we share with the manufacturers in the defense and aerospace industries in the US. And that has resulted in a dramatic contribution to the US defense and aerospace industry, which employs, by the way, 3.5 million Americans, in addition to many subcontractors who also benefit from those relationship between Israel and the US defense industry. We share the same lessons with the US Air Force and the US infantry and the US tank corps and the US military branches which operate missiles, all of which we receive from the US, but once again, we share with the armed forces our lessons, which enhance the performance of the U.S. Armed Forces, saves many lives, and certainly enables the U.S. to overcome military systems of enemies and adversaries which are positioned throughout the globe. We also share with the U.S. Much intelligence. In fact, according to the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, as he told me, the scope of intelligence shared by Israel exceeds the intelligence received by the U.S. from all NATO countries combined. A former chief of the U.S. Air Force intelligence said that if the U.S. were to procure that intelligence which it receives from Israel, if the US were to procure it on its own, not through Israel, then the US would have to establish 5 CIAs. For our viewers' information, the budget of one CIA is almost $15 billion annually. That by itself means that the $3.8 billion annual investment in Israel yields back to the Americans over 500% intelligence-wise, in addition to the benefits to the U.S. Armed Forces, in addition to the benefits to the U.S. defense and aerospace industry. The bottom line is that our relationship is not a one-way street where the U.S. gives and Israel receives. It's much more complex than that. It's a two-way street, which is mutually beneficial to both the U.S. and Israel.
Yes, it is. I really appreciate you educating our listeners on that return on investment, on the intelligence return on investment. I will just say this. When we saw what they called the quote unquote border bill a few weeks back, I was very critical of that. It was not a border bill. It was supposed to be, but it seemed to me that the one that got the most money was Ukraine. And I feel quite certain that Ukraine does not have the same return on investment that Israel does to the U.S. And I really appreciate you pointing this out so eloquently, because it's something that we as Americans, we need to know it, we need to understand it, and we need to be pointing this out to our representatives so that they vote to continue funding even more to Israel, and not these companies, or pardon me, countries that take and take and take. And what do you get back? Nothing but violence. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit opinionated on that, but you touched on a great point, and I appreciate it. And I think our listeners will also.
Well, it's not only limited, by the way, to defense and aerospace and intelligence and armed services. It also has to do with the commercial sector. In Israel, there are over 250 American high-tech giants operating their own research and development centers, leveraging the brain power in Israel, leveraging the very challenging reality in Israel, which has produced many out-of-the-box high-tech applications. And as a result, those 250 American high-tech giants have enhanced dramatically their global competitiveness, which once again has resulted in expanded employment in the US, and once again attests to the very, very unique relationship between the US and Israel. A few years ago, the CEO of Microsoft said to the board of directors of Microsoft that by the day Microsoft is becoming more and more an Israeli-like company due to the impact of the research and development conducted in Israel upon the substance and the competitiveness of Microsoft products during the current war between Israel and Hamas terrorists, which erupted in October 7. About a month following the eruption of the war, the CEO of Intel, one of the global high-tech giants, announced an additional investment in Israel of $25 billion. And when asked by a Fox Business interviewer why making such a major decision now when there is a war in Israel and so much uncertainties, the response by the Intel CEO was that based on Intel's study of the Israeli resurgence following every war and every wave of terrorism, Intel has concluded that this is the time to invest in Israel because they expect the current war, just like previous wars, to produce many more non-conventional, out-of-the-box Israeli applications, which are going to make a difference for Intel in the global competition. And he concluded, by the way, the interview by saying that when it comes to resilience, the Israeli resilience is second to none. And
I would agree with that.
would
Yep.
add maybe similar to the Texas resilience.
I think that is a great analogy and a great connection, and you're absolutely right. No doubt about that. So, we also have not discussed the contribution Israel has made to the medical industry. That is another area that Israel has been a world leader in that. And so that's a little bit off topic, but it came to mind. And I think, if I had to say what is a common theme through our time today is really highlighting the benefits that we get back from Israel from our investment. And you've done that so well. And so is there anything else you want to add along that line before we move on to our next topic, or did you have something else in mind?
Well, we can move on to your next topic. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we had talked earlier about, some of the things going on with Blinken. I mean, let's just call it out what it is. And I would like to get your thoughts on how that relationship is viewed in Israel, and how do the Israeli governing officials review him? Do they respect him? And if I'm asking questions that you're not comfortable answering, feel free to say I'd rather not comment. But I'd like to know from your perspective in Israel, what do you all think of Blinken?
Well, if one examines the track record of Secretary Blinken in particular, the State Department in general, you find out that systematically the State Department and Secretary Blinken have been on the wrong side of the issues from the American perspective. It was the State Department which back in 1978-79 stabbed the back of the Shah of Iran and provided tailwind to Ayatollah Khomeini to topple the Shah, who was the American policeman of the Gulf, and take over control of Iran. It was the State Department that courted Saddam Hussein of Iraq literally until the day he invaded Kuwait, threatening every single pro-American Arab regime, oil-producing regime in the Persian Gulf area. It was the State Department that welcomed Bashar Assad, who succeeded his father Hafiz Assad in Syria, as a welcome transformation of Syria because of his background in Britain, not paying attention to his ideology and his vision, which has been exposed as quite satanic in real terms. It has been the State Department and Antony Blinken in particular that welcomed the turbulence on the Arab Street, which erupted at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, and is still raging as Arab Spring, rather than identify it for what it is, Arab tsunami. They went as far as referring to it as the Facebook revolution, youth revolution, march towards peace, none of which had anything to do with reality. It had to do with alternative reality, which has been developed by the State Department for decades and by Secretary Blinken as well in recent years. And certainly, it was Secretary Blinken at that time, National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, who partook in the State Department initiative in 2011 of launching a military assault against Gaddafi of Libya, failing to notice that Gaddafi, who used to be a terrorist, became by that time, by 2011, a major warrior against Islamic terrorism. He even transferred his nuclear infrastructure to the US. It's still in Tennessee until today. But in any case, the Secretary Blinken, Hillary Clinton initiative of leading a military, NATO military offensive against Gaddafi resulted in the lynching of Gaddafi by Islamic terrorists, transforming Libya into a chaotic state, a platform of anti-US Islamic terrorism. And as happens always, the terrorists once again proved their eagerness to bite the hand that feeds them. And in reaction to the US major role in toppling Gaddafi and enabling the Muslim terrorists to lynch him, the Muslim terrorists apprehended the US Consulate General in Benghazi, lynched the US ambassador to Libya along with two other Americans at that time in Benghazi. And again, until today, Libya is a platform of Islamic terrorism, series of civil wars, and last and not least, the issue of Egypt, where Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, with the help of Tony Blinken, at that time National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, they literally stabbed pro-US Mubarak of Egypt in the back, provided tailwind to the Muslim Brotherhood to take over control of Egypt, and not realizing maybe that the Muslim Brotherhood, which were established back in 1928, adhere to a vision, and that vision culminates with bringing the so-called infidel West to submission, and primarily the so-called infidel USA. When it
Yes.
comes to Israel, currently Secretary Blinken is pushing for the establishment of a Palestinian state based on a speculative future vision of a Jewish state, Palestinian state, peacefully coexisting side by side. Now, who can oppose such a benevolent vision? The problem is that there is no substantiation in the track record of the Palestinians to allow for peaceful coexistence. And the interesting reality is that while the State Department, led by Secretary Blinken, is embracing the idea of a Palestinian state, every single pro-American Arab regime embraces the Palestinians with very, very sugar-coated rhetoric. The talk is very, very embracing. The Arab talk is embracing the Palestinians. But the Arab walk has been anywhere from indifferent to negative. And the reason is that while the State Department focuses on the Palestinian moderate talk when they meet American and Western policymakers, when they speak on American or Western media, the Arabs are not concerned about the Palestinian talk. The Arabs are concerned about the Palestinian intra-Arab walk. And the Arabs remember that in the 50s, during the 1950s, Egypt allowed the Palestinians to terrorize Israel from Egyptian soil, but within a year or 2 years, the Palestinian leadership joined forces with Muslim Brotherhood terrorists terrorizing their host Egyptian regime, which forced the Palestinian leadership to run away from Egypt to Syria. Syria allowed them to terrorize Israel, but within few years, they joined forces with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, terrorizing once again their host regime. And they had to run away to Jordan. They tried to topple the central regime, the pro-American Hashemite regime in Jordan, which triggered a civil war in Jordan in September of 1970. And they had to run away to Lebanon. They plundered Lebanon for 12 years until 1982, when they were expelled from Lebanon. And in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, August of 1990, Kuwait at that time was the most hospitable and generous Arab host to Palestinians, all of whom associates of Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinians stabbed their hostess in the back, joining the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza were celebrating the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, and that was the reason for the leader of Kuwait, upon restoring power, complement of American blood and American financial military resources, the first thing that the leader of Kuwait did was expelling almost whole 400,000 Palestinians from Kuwait. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan, they don't forget and they don't forgive. And therefore, they rightly consider the proposed Palestinian state as an entity which would add fuel, not water, to the Middle East fire. They also are aware that the Palestinian leadership maintains close ties with North Korea, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with China, and with Russia. And as a result, they shower the Palestinians with embracing talk, but the walk has been, as I mentioned, anywhere from indifferent to negative, and a metaphoric expression of the difference between the State Department attitude towards the Palestinian state and the Arab attitude is that when Palestinian leaders come to Washington, they are received in a red carpet manner. When they arrive to Arab capitals, at best they get a shabby doormat reception. And I think it's time for the State Department to inquire how come the Arabs do not accord Palestinians a red carpet treatment as they receive when they come to New York or Washington, D.C.
I've got my own how come questions. I want to know how come our current administration is clearly making decisions that support UN policies that are tearing our country apart, and they're certainly doing no favors to Israel. We recently saw the Hamas tunnel and all the operations center under the UN building in Gaza. And they tried to say, oh, well, the UN people said, oh, we didn't know about that. And it's like, well, that's interesting because we have video footage from a news source in the U.S. showing reporters that went in. They videoed the computers and the links that went from that underground tunnel up to the first floor of the UN building. So you can't tell me they were unaware. Not only were they unaware, they were complicit.
Well, there's no doubt that the State Department has followed what I would define as cosmopolitan worldview, multilateral worldview, and Secretary Blinken has been a leader of that cosmopolitan worldview, preferring working together with the anti-US United Nations, with the very feeble Europeans, rather than for the US to follow an independent national security action. That's one of the reasons for the US to approach the Ayatollahs of Iran in a diplomatic manner rather than have an effective military option hovering above the head of the Ayatollahs of Iran. And that's the reason that the State Department has always preferred the diplomatic option over the military option, which would be suitable for Western Europe, for North America, but certainly not in the Middle East, where there hasn't been yet intra-Muslim or intra-Arab peaceful coexistence. Ever since the 7th century, when Islam came to the world, there hasn't been yet intra-Muslim peaceful coexistence. And here we are told by the Secretary of State that if Israel does go forward with a dramatic concession to Palestinian terrorists, that is going to induce the Palestinians to accord us, the so-called infidel Jews, that which they are yet to accord to one another. I wish that Pollyannish vision would be part of global reality, but it's not there. And I usually resort to what I learned in Texas during the many years I stayed and visited Texas. In Texas, I learned that we must not kiss chicken until they grow lips. And the last time I checked the Middle East chicken, they haven't grown lips yet. Once they do grow lips, this hawk is going to be a flaming dove. But until they grow lips, we must be very, very cautious. We must not bury the hatchet. We must carry it very, very firmly in our hand, or else we are going to be doomed.
You used the term cosmopolitan. I'm going to say it differently, and tell me if I am wrong, but I call that a one world government, and I'm not in favor of that. And I have a feeling from what I've heard you say that you're not either. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, whether it's one government society, one government world, whether it is many governments working in concert, the reality is if the US subordinate its policy to the whims of the membership of the UN, which ever since 1949, when it was established, has been an epicenter of anti-US policies, then such a state of mind is bound to be anti-American. It's bound to damage American interests. When you are determined to work in concert with the Europeans, which sadly have lost their will to flex a muscle against the threat of Islamic terrorism, if at all there is any muscle left there. Once again, it undermines America's best interest, especially when such an approach relies on NATO. Now, NATO used to be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but recently it has become the no action, talk only organization. And it's not advisable for the US to subordinate its own national security requirements, homeland security requirements, to such a feeble entity as the Europeans have become.
I have discovered you and I have something else in common. On your website, you said you were not politically correct, and I am seeing that. And guess what? I'm not either. I just call it like I see it and tell it like it is.
Well, you know, political correctness is synonym to conventional wisdom. And the number one enemy of political correctness and conventional wisdom happens to be the march of facts. And when you analyze the facts, at least in the Middle East, and compare it to conventional wisdom at the Department of State, you realize that that conventional wisdom is dramatically out of touch with the facts on the ground in the Middle East. And sadly, the proof is in the pudding. And the American pudding in the Middle East hasn't been very positive in recent years, where we have seen more and more pro-American Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt getting closer and closer to Russia and China, and not because they are not pro-American. It's because the cosmopolitan policy, the diplomatic option towards Iran, has forced them to become closer and closer to the Chinese and the Russian, and that has been expressed by buying, for instance, Russian military systems. It has been expressed by Saudi Arabia negotiating with China the construction of a nuclear reactor in Saudi Arabia, and it all has to do with US policy towards Iran, namely embracing and appeasing the Ayatollahs, which have been since 1979 the world leading epicenter of anti-US terrorism, anti-US drug trafficking, anti-US money laundering, and anti-US proliferation of ballistic and other advanced military technologies. And by the way, not limited to the Persian Gulf or to the Middle East. The Ayatollahs of Iran are deeply entrenched in South America, Central America, all the way to the US-Mexico border. And then are entrenched there together with Hezbollah terrorists who are in alignment with every single drug cartel in Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil. They collaborate very closely with every single Latin American terror organization. They coordinate their movements with every single anti-American government in Latin America. And recently, Hezbollah terrorists have been training drug cartels in Mexico in the areas of car bombings and improvised explosive devices, aiming to exercise it, to practice it on the soil of the United States. And while all that goes on, the current State Department, the Secretary of State, have suspended economic sanctions of Iran, which has enabled Iran to expand, for instance, their exportation of oil from 500,000 barrels per day, as it was when the sanctions were in place, to anywhere between 2 and 3 million barrels per day, as it has been since February 2021, when Secretary Blinken stepped into the office of the Secretary of State. That means, in terms of dollars, $100 billion added to the national income of the Ayatollahs. When you observe Iran since February 2021, you find out that almost all $100 billion have not been invested in enhancing standard of living in Iran, advancing education and welfare and medicine and healthcare in Iran. Almost all of it has been invested to bolster the anti-American vision of the Ayatollahs. And that vision has to do with bringing the great American Satan to submission. And therefore, since the early 1980s, they have focused on expanding their foothold in Latin America. They don't intend to convert Latin Americans to Islam. Their intent is to weaken the US, and they rightly consider Latin America, all the way to the border with Mexico, to be the soft underbelly of the United States. And all that in addition to a very large number of sleeper cells, which they have already established in the US.
Yes, they have.
And recently, in fact, February of 14 of 2024, the FBI director, Chris Wray, visited Israel, meeting with the top echelon of Israel's Secret Service and police to find out how do we face the Islamic terrorism during our war against Hamas in Gaza. And according to the FBI director, he came to Israel due to his own intelligence suggesting that there are a number of Iranian-supported Islamic terrorist organizations who are inspired by the Hamas terror offensive on Israel from October 7, inspired to carry out similar actions against U.S. installations throughout the globe and on the U.S. mainland itself. By the way, he repeated that assessment in his House Committee on Homeland Security and more recently in his Senate Committee on Homeland Security, reiterating his assessment that Iran is pushing Islamic terrorists to carry out more and more terrorism against the U.S., also in the homeland itself. Sadly, the State Department has not embraced that assessment by the FBI director.
That is very sad. And it's beyond sad. It makes me angry, and I think it makes a lot of other Americans angry. If you look at the polls, the number one concern of voters right now today, it's not, I'm just going to say it because I already told you I am not politically correct. The number one concern of voters today is not the cognitive decline of Biden. Everybody sees that. We know it. Our number one concern as voters is the border. And yet all of our representatives are sticking their head in the sand. They are not paying attention to what the voters want, and they're not paying attention when our FBI director goes to learn how to defend against what we already know is here. It's unconscionable. I do not know how those people, when I say those people, our representatives, I do not know how they sleep at night.
Well, anyone who recognizes the very, very smart people, smart capabilities, sadly, in Tehran, in Iran, the very, very skillful planning of terrorism, which they have demonstrated, anyone who recognizes that would also conclude that certainly they have taken advantage of the fact that 2 million illegals are crossing into the US every single year during the last 3 years. And
You want to
one can only speculate how many Iranian controlled terrorists have gone through the border with the US, and how many sleeper cells have been established, and how many terror capabilities have been set in motion in the US homeland itself.
Yes, and I will give you a little bit of an update on that number. You are absolutely correct. 2 to 3 million in the last 3 years. In the month of January alone, the U.S. Border Patrol recently released a number of, it was over 900,000 illegals had crossed our border in the month of January alone. You annualize that, it's about 11.5 million people. That is an invasion. That is not immigration, and it's weaponized invasion. So,
Well, again, I think the duty of policymakers, the duty of any person is to look at life realistically, irrespective of how frustrating it may be, how inconvenient it may be, how much blood, sweat, and tears is required to invest in order to make it in such a frustrating world. The worst way to look at the world is through an alternative reality. And when one analyzes the State Department track record, at least in the Middle East, which is my area, this track record documents the fact that the State Department has based its Middle East policy on alternative reality. And that reality has led to a systematic record of failures at the expense of U.S. national security, at the expense of U.S. homeland security, and at the expense of the national security of every one of U.S. allies in the Middle East and beyond.
that's right. Thank you
Okay.
for your incredible insight and all that you have educated us on today. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to when we recontinue this on part 2.
Okay, thank you very much. And if any of the viewers would like to get more information, it's available in my website, which is www, and in one word, the Ettinger Report, Ettinger with double T.
And we will include that in the comment section below our video. So
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for a wonderful educational visit, and we look forward to part 2.
Absolutely. Looking forward. Thank you.